that'll be on our YouTube page. See, Aaron, how technologically savvy we are? Only took me like 6 years how to figure this out. Welcome, everybody, to our Wednesday morning study session that still doesn't have a name after almost 10 years. We'll get the name probably at some point in the distant future. We're aiming for before the 21st century ends. Yeah. So last week we began a study of the Jews in Poland, which, unfortunately, I wasn't thinking we thought we'd do it in 1 week, but obviously that was not near enough. So we went through the history of Jews in Poland since the very beginning when they first arrived, somewhere around the year before the year 1000, but provable to just after the year 1000. Talked about the early history and all the way through the 19th century. And that's where we kind of ended last time, as we talked a little bit about how Jews were doing in Polish culture. This is all pre-World War I. And what we really think about when we talk about Poland, obviously, is that how terrible things were. But again, that is a generic statement that isn't always true, and in many cases isn't. There was a reason there were a lot of Jews in Poland, because they were doing pretty well there for a pretty significant time, as we talked about last week. There were difficulties, but there is a reason that Poland became the largest Jewish community in the world. And at one point, about 75% of all Jews lived in that area. And so we talked about the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment of the 19th century. And we talked about the Musar. I don't know if we talked about the Musar movement, but we talked about Orthodox Judaism, Hasidic Judaism, which has a lot of founding nearby. We talked a little bit about Zionism, which starts to become part of the culture in the 20th century. So as Poland is kind of coming into the modern world a little bit behind some of the other places in Europe, but nonetheless, what you see is these isms start to become popular, as in other places: communism, Zionism, same as what we could say for places like Russia, which at points, of course, controlled what would be known as Poland at different times. So by the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, life in Poland could be pretty good for Jews, especially during the Second Republic. Zionism was popular. There were Jews who were in politics. There were Jews in a lot of fields. There were a lot of wealthy Jews. Overall, if you were Jewish, odds were at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that you were probably financially doing pretty well compared to most other people. There were certain businesses that were very heavily Jewish. And so it was probably a pretty good time to be a Jew. This was all before World War I. They were a lot of Jews willing to fight for Poland. Obviously, there were wars such as the Russian Civil War, the Polish-Ukrainian War, the Polish later Soviet War. Most of the Jews by the World War I living in this area were doing pretty well. Now, of course, we're then go into World War I, which changes things, but not as much as we would think. World War I, of course, was at the time the Great War, which was, I remember reading anybody remember, have you ever heard of Encyclopedia Brown? Anybody? It's a children's series of books where this Encyclopedia Brown is like a child's detective is always figuring out, cases. And one of them was, how do you prove a sword was fake when it said a gift to so-and-so in 1920 for his service in World War I? And the answer, of course, is they didn't know it was World War I in 1920. They didn't know until, of course, after World War II. You can't know. It's like, so during the war, there were a lot of Jews who ended up being Bolsheviks. There were a lot of Jews who fought for Poland, as we know. In the Versailles Treaty, for those of you who don't know, there were pieces that ensured Jews had the same legal rights as other people in Poland. And so there was ideas of religious freedom and religious tolerance. So the Jews have been doing well. Although some of them still looked at Jewish, a lot of them looked at themselves as Polish. From 1860 to 1921, the number of Jews in Poland went up about 6 or 7 times or 8 times, went from about 200,000 to 1.5 million. That, of course, is eventually going to increase to almost 3.5 million right before World War II. And so Jews were moving there and people were having kids because it was a vibrant Jewish community. You think about culture, you think about in America, all the Yiddish theater. Well, they had that in Poland too. Polish newspapers, they had Yiddish newspapers. Jews were speaking Polish and Yiddish. So really the interim up until World War II was pretty good, although there were some issues, but Polish Jews were involved in manufacturing and retail, a lot of small Jewish businesses. There were an incredible number of Jewish professionals. It's believed that at one point over 50% of all doctors in Poland were Jewish. That a third at one point of all lawyers in Poland were Jewish. So they were going to school. And incredible, you think of it as kind of very similar to America, but much higher numbers. Zionism was a big deal, and a lot of people think that Poland and Israel has issues now, which is true, but at different periods. It's funny that when things went bad in Poland, the one thing Jews and the Polish officials supported were Zionism. Poland was a very big Zionist promoter for obvious reasons. Why? Because it's a way to get rid of the Jews. So as times got worse, Poland became even more Zionistically supportive, working with Israel to have Jews move there. Of course, this is later on. Jews were in their own kind of political party, the Socialist General Jewish Labor, Bund, or as everybody knew it as the Bund, and also represented the right and left. I mean, this was a really good time, the 1920s, especially for Jews in Poland. You think of people like, Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's going to later win the Nobel Prize. They had Jewish composers, none of whom I ever heard of, because obviously I'm not that knowledgeable when it comes to music. Jewish painters. I mean, this was a time where all of these things were flourishing in the 1920s and early 1930s. They had other people. They had an economics professor win a Nobel Prize. They had Jewish sports clubs. They were a large number of Jews were studying at universities, including Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, both who would become prime ministers of Israel. A lot of the Jews believed themselves to be Polish, but a lot of them still looked themselves as Jewish. But you had a lot of Jewish organizations that wanted to acculturate Jews into the Polish world. And so it was relatively a good time for Jews. And again, we think of all of these things happening in America with the immigration here, but it was happening over there as well. So up until the 1920s, until probably after the market fell in the Depression, things were going pretty well there for Jews. And this is something we rarely talk about, because we talk about Poland, we generally talk about the anti-Semitism. We talk about the Poles who worked with the Nazis to capture and kill Jews. We talk about the periods in history where Jews were brutalized, the Chelmitsky Rebellion we talked about, but we also, as we mentioned last week, tend to ignore the large periods of time where Jews were thriving. And this, there's a period of 500 years where they're doing really well there, have some off years, and then do well for another 200 years. And this is another good period for them as Poland tries to modernize itself with the rest of Europe, and Jews are increasingly doing better and better. Again, it's the rule of Jewish life. If you live in a country that is educated and open, Jews tend to do well. And there's a very nice period of time here where, of course, Jews are doing well. Excuse me. This is all going to change, but up to this point, if you went to Poland, you would see Jewish sports clubs, you would see Zionist clubs, you would see Yiddish theater, you would see traveling troops, you would see Jewish literature thriving, you would see Jewish businesses thriving. Yes, there was anti-Semitism, there was jealousy, but a very high percentage of people going to college were Jewish. And it's not really till the 1930s that this really starts to change. And a lot of that is for a couple reasons. You have a lot of Russian Jews who got caught up in the Bolshevik Revolution, ended up on the wrong side, and are leaving Russia and going into Poland. So they're seen as outsiders. You have, of course, probably most importantly, the Depression, which is worldwide, which probably had the biggest effect because we know what it did also in Germany. And so while Jewish life was getting a little bit worse, there was also periods where they might have a government that was very supportive. There was a prime minister or just president who was very supportive of the Jewish community, and he really helped bring the Jews back from this beginnings of the Depression, the beginnings of things going wrong. But as soon as he was no longer, and his name was Pilsudski, but once he was no longer in charge, then things got worse, and he died in 1935. So what happened was, eventually, as things got worse, the government started to privatize things, taking away Jewish family businesses. The country began to isolate itself. Does it sound familiar? As right-wing governments. At the same time, though, as I mentioned earlier, the government was supporting organizations like Beitar. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Beitar. It was kind of the biggest international Zionist movement for kids, especially everything from military training to just going to camps. Very, very big supporters of Beitar in Poland. No small surprise that Menachem Begin, coming from Poland, is one of course, the big supporters. So they allowed Zionists to march in parades even when things were going very bad for Judaism, for Jews, because of course they wanted Jews to leave. It was one of the last countries that, I think it may have been at one time the only country in Europe that really allowed Jews freely to go. Michael. And you're on mute, Michael.
And I just put my hand up. I was stretching. I apologize.
Okay, no stretching, and it's okay. Do you have anything you want to add? Okay. So we talk a lot about World War II and the period right before, but we have to remember there was a lot of moments where Jews were doing so well.
See, unless you wave your hand. There you go.
Okay, somebody's hand up.
Yeah,
Oh, Flossie, sorry.
While this is happening in Poland, is the same feeling to Jews happening in Germany? Did it happen first in Poland or more Germany where it was so uncomfortable being Jewish?
I think a lot of it, movements were different. I mean, you got to remember the Polish people weren't necessarily supportive of Nazis when, as Germany, they both didn't like Jews, but it wasn't the same reason. And it was considered, I think, unpopular to align yourself with the Nazis if you were Polish before World War II. And today, even more so, because the Nazis were not very nice to the Poles. We know what they do to the Jews. It gets a lot more, newspaper time, but they were not particularly good to the Nazis. Did not like the Poles. They liked the Jews less, but Nazis did not like the Poles. They didn't like the fact that the Poles were connected to communism, that they didn't like them ethnically, racially either. And so one of the issues that happened in Poland was it's a Catholic stronghold, and the Catholic policy towards Jews went south in the 1930s, and that had a big effect. I think obviously, as I mentioned, the Depression was probably the number one issue, and what was happening around Europe, especially in America. I mean, that had it. So by the 1930s, a fairly anti-Semitic party known as the National Democracy kind of started to take center stage, and it really hit Jews who were living in smaller towns and smaller areas. So in smaller areas where there was still a high percentage of Jews, but not as much, you started to have Jews couldn't go to school. Jews had to sit in different places. If they were in school, they had to be sitting somewhere else. But you got to remember a huge percentage of the student body in colleges was Jewish, maybe a fifth. But after a 10-year period, it went from like 20% to like 7%, and not in 20, about 8-year period. So Jews were thriving, as we generally do when we're in a society that's fairly educated, that's open, as it was. But with the Catholics, the anti-Semitism starting to grow, Poland really, by 1935, 36, 37, that is when everything went downhill. So, in some areas, the Jews were 40 or 50% of certain areas, and at times they owned up to 80% of private businesses. I mean, they were jewelers and tailors and hat makers, what you think of, but making money, not like what they were doing not what they were doing in the shtetl. This is in Poland. And so they were doing very well until all of a sudden things started going wrong, as often happens in the 1930s.
Rabbi,
And so, I'm sorry?
I just wanted to make one quick comment.
No, make long comments.
I was browsing through Netflix, and I think it was on Netflix. There's a documentary that is on now, or it will be coming up very shortly, about the Jews in Shanghai. I think there were 18.
Really? Very cool.
Shanghai, including several large yeshivas that left in total. I don't remember the date when they left, but it was certainly in the 1930s, and it would be worth a separate talk almost about the Jews of Shanghai.
Oh yeah,
and,
I think that's a great one.
I think it's on Netflix.
Yeah, well, once it comes out, is it already out or is it coming out?
I think it's probably out already.
Write that down.
Well, that might be a great one. There's different two Jewish periods. There's the historic Jewish period, and then there's the Jews of Shanghai. We'll talk about that. But when it comes to Poland, I think it's very important to remember that even though the blood libel had come in during the 1930s with the Catholic Church turning against Judaism there, the Polish government was not in line with the German government. The Polish government was not trying to kill Jews. It did feel like there may be too many Jews in the country, but it was supporting mass immigration to Israel or to Palestine. And the reason it didn't happen was not because of the Poles, was because of the British stopped allowing them in. I mean, you got to remember that, Zeb Jabotinsky, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir are all from this area living there. And so this idea that Jews could move and live abroad was very enticing to Poland. In fact, even as early as when they were trying to, after World War I, Poland was one of the main supporters in the League of Nations for creating a place for Jews to live, so they could get some of them out of Poland. But of course, that didn't work out. So in the 1930s, they were supporting a Jewish state. Poland was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, suppliers of arms to the Haganah and Irgun. So you don't hear about this part because obviously Poland had a lot of things they shouldn't have been doing before the war and during the war, but it wasn't all terrible. In fact, many Jews would have preferred living in Poland to other places in the world. However, of course, by the time the war starts in 1939, the anti-Semitism was peaking in Poland. And so the Jewish population that had been fairly well-to-do only 10 or 15 years later was now, poor and destitute in many respects. And it had only been in a few years. It was really but we can never assume that the Poles liked working with Hitler. They did not. They were not supportive generally, even though they did a lot of terrible things to the Jews. They were not Germans in terms of, and we understand what's going on there, and it's getting worse and worse. But even though there were a lot of Poles who did work with the Germans to help kill Jews during World War II, obviously the final solution was in Poland, where a lot of the camps were in Poland. And a lot of Poles did. There were a lot of Poles who actually did hide Jews. And you also have to remember that the punishment for helping Jews was death for you, your family, and probably anybody who lived in the neighborhood. I mean, the Nazis would just go kill everybody. So if you were caught harboring a Jew, it was instant death, no ifs or ands or buts for you and your entire family. So you have to remember that this is one of the reasons there was a lot of anti-Semitism. A lot of it was just the feeling that there were too many Jews in Poland. But when World War II came about, things, of course, got worse. There were Jews who fought in the Polish army, although Poland was taken down pretty quickly. There were Jews fighting alongside Poles to defend Warsaw. There were Jews fighting alongside Poles to fight against Soviet Union. So after Soviet Union and Germany had annexed different parts of Poland, about 60+% of Jews ended up in Poland, and a little less than 40% were in the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, it would have been better to be in the Soviet Union, which is kind of ironic because being in the Soviet Union was not a good place to be Jewish. But if you were in the Soviet Union, you were being conscripted into the military. If you were part of a Zionist or anti-communist anything, you were sent to gulags or sent to Siberia. Sometimes you were killed, but it was not as bad, of course, as they found out later as being part of the area annexed by Germany. So any questions or thoughts yet before we get to Stuart?
I'm a little thrown by the history as you present it in the 1920s, and that's not by any specific knowledge of history, but by my family's history, because my family started very serious emigration from Warsaw in about 1920, 21. And it was, my great-grandfather ended up leaving a little later, but I know there was a move. My grandmother and her sister both emigrated, one to Israel, one to the United States in about 2021. And they had three brothers, all of whom were trying to emigrate all of that time. What is it? Do you have any knowledge or idea of what it is that was driving Jews? And they were not Zionists. Do you have any idea of, or at least my grandmother wasn't. Do you have any idea of what it was that was driving Jews out of Warsaw that early?
Well, again, when I say times were good, they weren't as good as in America. I mean, they were better than we would think. They were better than a lot of places, but it was not as good as probably living in Western Europe or America or Canada. So there were still a lot of issues they were facing. And there was anti-Semitism on many levels the whole time. So really, immigration to America also had ceased to exist really in the 1920s. So you couldn't get into America. You couldn't get into a lot of places. And so, but again, you're always looking for a better place. So to say Poland was the best place to live, definitely not. Was it a pretty good place compared to others? Probably. But, it just ended up being, there were a lot of issues because of the Russian Jews moving in, because the population was so large, because of jealousy, later because of the Catholics, because later the Depression. So, but you did have governments that were very supportive of Jews. You did have governments that were not. You did have a population, many of which were fine with the Jewish communities until probably the Depression. So I'm just saying it wasn't as bad as we think of when we think of the 1930s. Karen. I think you may be on mute still, Karen.
You're mute.
You were talking about when you said when the Russian Jews started moving in. Was that more because the border had changed after World War I, because they had been Russian Jews and now they were Polish Jews again? Or was it because they actually, left where they lived and moved into Poland?
A lot of them left because, again, remember there's a civil war in Russia, and a lot of Jews ended up on the wrong side of the coin, and that's why a lot of them moved to Poland to his greener pastures.
Okay.
Now, a lot stayed in Russia. Obviously, there was a really significant population there, but the population in Poland just exponentially increased, and it wasn't just because they were having a lot of babies; it was because people were moving there. Because, it was greener pastures, Larry. And you also couldn't get into America. And there was, unless you were Zionist, you weren't moving to Israel because there's really nothing there.
I think it is kind of a combination of, like Dickens said, the best of times, the worst of times. You also have to remember that the last day of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, I think they bombed what was the largest synagogue in Europe, which was the Great Synagogue in Poland. So it was still a very, very thriving, and by the numbers, of course, we could see that the Jewish community was still, thriving. And people, even though there was a large immigration, the natural tendency, I think, is for people to stay, to think that they are Polish, and particularly in Warsaw. I have some pictures later, if we had a chance, I might show them of when we were in Warsaw, that the Jews were not really in any kind of a ghetto in Warsaw, that they were distributed throughout the city, that they were, unlike what they were in the rest of Poland, where Jews were in shtetls and easy to find and things like that. In Warsaw, they were generally integrated into the community, and they were the more progressive Jews. But the Great Synagogue was demolished, and when Jane and I were in Warsaw, we went searching for the site where it was, and luckily in one of the guidebooks, they had indicated that the site it was demolished is now what's called the Peugeot building, which happened to be one of the largest buildings, like about 15, 20 stories in Warsaw. And there's a little plaque that you really have to search for, and I have a photo of that, which states this is the site on which the last day of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the Nazis.
I don't know if I saw that. May not have been there when I was there. But it's a very complicated situation because you've got Poland is being halved between Russia and the Soviet Union and Germany. Jews don't all know which is the better place to go. I mean, we know now, but at the time, Soviet Union was not a good place for Jews already. And plus the fact that the Soviet Union was taking over all businesses, Jewish businesses were then going under, obviously. So everybody became broke in the Soviet Union. But there were a lot of people who realized being in the Soviet Union was better. So they were actually very supportive of the Soviet Union and tried to serve with them and help them out. So you had a mixture. So you had Jews who were excited that the Soviets were the ones taking over Poland because it was better than the alternative. But there are a lot of Jews who did not realize that. Karen?
I wanted to comment and just make people aware, because one of the things you talked about, Jews couldn't go to the United States. We had open borders for everyone except the Chinese until 1921. And that's when Congress started passing laws limiting how many immigrants could come in. And they did it on a proportional basis. They said, okay, they started off in 1921 saying, okay, we're going to take the 1910 census and we'll allow in, let's say we set the quota as 2 million people can come to the United States. Proportionately, we will give them the percentage based on their percentage. Let's see, the percentage of native-born people, foreign-born people from that country. I think I'm saying it right. Anyway, the idea was it was proportional to how many people from that country already were in the United States. By 1924, which was the Johnson-Reed Act, I believe it was called, they said, no, you know what, 1910 isn't a good enough date. We really want to limit the number of pretty much Jews and Catholics coming in. So they reset the quotas to the 1890 census. Well, Jews started emigrating here, big numbers, after 1881. And so by going back to the 1890 census, they were so limited. That's why so many people who wanted to get out of Europe in the 1930s and 40s couldn't get into the United States. Yeah. You had these quotas. So it was delivered. It was very much intended to limit Jews. So it was Poland, Italy.
Yeah, it wasn't just for Jews. It was for,
right.
It was almost all immigrants.
Right, but it was
basically
primarily Southern and Eastern European immigrants.
And a lot of people couldn't get out. But again, life was pretty good in Poland after the war, after World War I. And so, it was thriving in many respects. There was a lot of issues. But when World War II came and, you had a lot of Jewish communists, obviously, who were going to support the Soviet Union as opposed to, and so you had a mixture of Jews being sent to gulags and Jews fighting for the Soviet Union. And of course, in German-controlled Poland, things went downhill pretty quickly, as we all know. Even though Poland did not support Hitler in any respects, they were really, taken over completely and had really little choice. There were a lot of Poles who did work with the Nazis, which is the issue now because they won't admit that. But there were also a lot of Poles who, I think there was a higher number of Polish non-Jews who helped Jews than of any other country. But obviously there were more Jews in Poland. So there were a lot who helped. But when the Soviet took over, basically, not only does it annex everything, and of course arrests everybody, all the press, they take over, put people, if you're a Zionist, you're going to jail. If you're part of the government, you're going to jail. If you're a teacher or a priest, you might be going to jail or even killed. So Poles it is happening to Poles and Jews. But for many Jews, obviously being under it's funny in such a, depressing way that I would rather have lived under the Soviets in 1939 than Germany. So I'm excited that I get to be under the Soviets as opposed to Germany. If you look from it, and it's, but 3.5 million Jews in Poland before the war. And obviously it's going to get down to almost none. There'll still be some left, but some of the Jews are deported to into the Soviet Union to other places. And some of them actually joined the Irgun or joined some of the underground groups that were fighting. But as we know, out of every country in the world, the Polish Jewish community suffered the most. So maybe half of all the Jews killed in the Holocaust were Polish. So really, the extermination camps were in that area, especially, most famously Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek. So Poland is the center of the final solution. As Larry said, synagogues were destroyed. If you're a rabbi, you were made to be humiliated. You're already wearing the star by the early 1940s. Now, what's interesting is we saw. I'm sorry, Larry. Okay, we'll go to Stuart. Sorry, Larry. I thought you had it on.
I think there are two factors that have to be considered for the period that you were just talking about. One is, of course, that probably half or so or more of the Jewish population at that time was in Poland. So it was clear Poland was going to have the greatest number of lost Jews because they had by far the greatest number of Jews. That's point one. Point two, we're only a generation away from a lot of those Jews who were in Poland, who were really brought up with a Russian culture because it was a good chunk of Russia that became Poland after World War I. So I think that was a second characteristic. I think the third one was you have to remember, I think, that the concentration and death camps were not put in Poland because the Poles wanted them initially, but because Germany, for political and public relations reasons, didn't want them in Germany. So Poland was a convenient place to dump them. That the Poles seem to have rallied to the idea that the camps were there is a different but later story. But I think the early stories does not really place much burden on the Poles for the location of these camps.
Yeah, and I think that is very true. And we know there are a lot of Polish sympathizers, a lot of Poles who didn't like Jews. But as we mentioned earlier, the Poles were not overall supportive of Germany. In fact, unlike France, for instance, there was not a faux government set up that would be part of Germany, because Germany knew that they would never be able to do that in Poland because they were so disliked. So they didn't even try to set up some sort of fake government there. But there were a lot who did. Some of them did because they really just thought there were too many Jews. Some of them did it because they didn't like Jews. Some of them were jealous of Jews, and we know how much jealousy affects. But some of them were not willing they just looked the other way because they didn't want to be killed, or they didn't want their families to be killed. So because of what's happening now in Poland, it's just exasperating all these issues. But it's not every single Pole who wanted Jews killed. That's what often people think. And a lot of the Poles who were anti-Semitic, there was a lot of them did not want Jews killed. They wanted them to leave. So, which is not nice, but it's not to the level of what the Germans were doing. It was also very hard to hide Jews. I mean, you got to face it. Even though Jews were part of society, Jews had different accents. They didn't have knowledge of a lot of the culture. So if you're trying to blend in as a Jew, that means you have to learn how to use a knife and fork, use the right language, use the right slang. So it was really hard to hide somebody unless you were hiding them where they never saw light. So there were a lot of Poles who did hide them, and a lot of Poles were killed doing it. But it was just it was difficult. And plus Poland was suffering because of the depression like everybody else. So there wasn't a lot of food in Poland, and it was a really difficult state. So I'm not saying that Poles weren't bad. I'm just saying the Poles and the Nazis are not synonymous. And if you go to Poland today, which they do have these laws, and we'll discuss that in a minute. We need to rush through this. They did not like the Nazis, and the Nazis did not like them. So, and some people say, well, they went against the Jews because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That is not the case here. So, and we all know, obviously, what happens in the internment camps, the extermination camps. So we also know that along with some of the uprisings, there were Poles who were supportive of them during the uprisings, but there are also Poles who turned people in. So it was a little bit of everything going on there, but we all know that the 1942, the final solution is beginning, and the camps are going to be there, and the Poles just had to deal with it in the ways they did. And many just kind of looked the other way, and many turned people in, and some of them did protect Jews. So you had a wide range. Now we're rushing through that part. That's a pun. We're rushing through because, Russian. I think only Jeff and Michael got that one. So thank you, Karen. I appreciate it. Stuart, I got nothing from Stuart there for that one.
Yeah, you.
So what happens after World War II? And that is an area that we do talk about quite a bit as well. What happens after World War II? Well, in some cases, the Soviet Union had taken over all your property. You're not getting it back. In some cases, individuals had taken your property. You're not getting it back. And people are people and are willing to kill to keep their property, or if they think somebody's going to take it. And so the irony, of course, is after the Holocaust, a lot of Jews were killed returning to what had been their home, and they're killed by sometimes government people, but often by individuals. But after World War II, obviously, eventually, Poland becomes a satellite to the Soviet Union. So Jews now living there, and it's a really small number, because a lot of Jews who returned to their homes or to Soviet Union, that either way, that they got no place to go, so they leave, and they eventually come to some place in Europe. A small number go to Israel, some come to America. You probably go anywhere you can get to, but only a few thousand Jewish Poles are in the country after by the 1950s. There were some pogroms afterwards. So I don't think the after war, we all know that terrible things happened to Jews after the war. It wasn't anywhere near the level of the war, and it wasn't happening to every single person, but it did happen. And by the end, pretty much all Jewish land, but the land of others, was taken over by the government or by individuals. So basically, there was a declaration of abandoned property, and that was the expropriation that took place that approved all Jewish property and all property that had been owned being now part of the government. But of course, it's a communist nation now. Ironically, the Catholics were allowed to get their property back. The Soviet Union is not generally supportive, but they were, Michael.
Well, I was just going to add to that's not unique to Poland.
No, it's definitely not.
That seemed to be true of a lot of the Eastern European countries. When the Jews got back from the camps and they went to their hometowns, where the Soviets had taken over, they found that their property had been, already appropriated to others, and it's no longer theirs. So.
Yeah, and again, after the war, Poland, again, it was the only country that automatically gave you a visa to go to Palestine. For any Jew who wanted to go, you just went in, you got it. Obviously, the Jews didn't get into Palestine, but that was because England wouldn't let them in. But, Poles were working with Jabotinsky again, and with Begin, and with the Haganah, became the Israel Defense Force. So Poland was a very big supporter of Israel for a very particular reason, because they wanted to get rid of as many of the leftover Jews they had. And so that would change, obviously. It's a Soviet bloc country. So after the 6-Day War, it becomes completely anti-Israel until more modern times. But after the war, there were Jews who stayed. The Bund was reestablished and actually got a seat in the House at one point. But through communism, you also had to assimilate. So no more Yiddish, you got to speak Polish or maybe Russian. So times could be very difficult because we know Stalin was very strict, to say the least. But there were still, Yiddish theater was still allowed. There was still a chief rabbi. So it was, okay comparatively to many places, but not a place you want to live. Of course, this all changes for whatever reason, and there's many. The 6-Day War is like the moment where Eastern Bloc countries become really anti-Israel. And thank you. And so that's one of the time, and that's an international. 67 is like the moment where people who are hated Jews could say, well, I don't have to be anti-Jewish, I'll be anti-Israel, which is really anti-Jewish, but you could, disguise it in this new, and that's what's going on today. Anti-Israel is anti-Jewish. If people say I'm anti-Israel, I'm not anti-Semitic, well, you probably are. Criticizing Israel is a whole different thing. People criticize Israel for a variety of things. That's normal. But again, the difference is Israel's right to exist. And that is where the anti-Israel is coming in. It's not I'm anti an Israeli party or I'm anti an Israeli decision. I'm anti-Israel. And that's become the anti-Jewish of the modern era. So Jews are now living under communism. There's only a few thousand in Poland. That number is going to grow, of course, later. But by the 1970s, Israel and Poland are having some sort of, negotiations. Actually, Poland is the first Eastern Bloc country to negotiate with Israel to create liaisons with them. Because as we know, Poland, although it was a communist country, it really broke away from the Soviet Union before any of the other ones did. It was already breaking away and had broken away by the early 1980s. So it was before, of course, 1989. So by the end of communism officially in Poland, there's only 5,000 or 10,000 Jews. That's the 1989. So there's really, you've gone from 3.5 million to 5,000, maybe a little bit more because people, so that's a huge difference, 3.5 million to 5,000. And after communism falls, of course, the Jewish population is going to grow tenfold in Poland. Why does the Jewish population grow? For a lot of reasons, but most importantly, probably because we know what happens in the downfall of these Eastern Bloc countries. What does it mean? It means if you know how to make money, you can make money. If you know how to go to a place that has nothing and bring it into the modern world, there's probably money to be made. And so a lot of Jews do move to Poland, as they do to other places, to make money. And so it ends up being over 50,000 people. They also reinstitute some of the Yiddish theater. They have Jewish foundations. Synagogues start to open. There had already been a Warsaw Monument. You start to have more writers and scholars moving to Poland, and not just to study the Holocaust studies, but for other things. But there are a lot of different Jewish organizations. So by 2006, population was up to about over 20,000. We also know the March of the Living is established right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so you already have, if you don't know what that program is, a program for Jewish youth, but also Jewish adults to go to Poland and do the march from Auschwitz to Birkenau, and the same one that so many Jews did before they from the internment camp to the death camp. And it's become something that's done now for over 30 years. Anybody here go on that trip, by the way? I've never done it, but I know so many people have. And so, Jewish life didn't thrive, but it certainly started to get a lot better. That's also until the modern time. So what are the Jewish population? So
what is it today, Rabbi?
I think it's today like 40 or 50,000, isn't it?
How
much?
How much, Rabbi?
I think it's 40,000. How many is it there now? Did it get up to that number? Let me try. I forgot to check the number today.
Mr. Google, I just looked it up. Mr. Google said about 20,000.
20,000. Okay.
Mr. Google,
How much was it about 5 years ago?
Yeah, still far less than Germany, ironically.
Well, Germany's the only country in which the population is increasing.
Right,
The
rapidly.
Jewish population increased in the 1990s, but I don't think it's increased that much more. I thought there was more than 20,000. I know it got to 20,000 in the 1990s. I thought it had gone up a little bit more. As you say, it's only 20,000. I thought it was
that's what
more.
Google said, but they're frequently wrong.
Google is never wrong. So if Google says it is right. If anybody can find the population, I thought it was bigger. How did I not know it was only 20,000? I knew it was 20,000 in the 1990s, about 15 years ago, but I thought it increased a little bit. And so
I just looked it up and it says between 10 and 20,000 today.
so even less now. How much was it in 2010, 2015? That's when it got to the height.
I always have my tablet on my lap so I can look stuff up. Let's see.
Yeah, there's no.
Oh, I think that has to do with Jews who do not actively. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and the Jewish Agency for Israel estimate there's 25,000 to 100,000 living there, but not all of them identify as Jewish officially. So a lot of them will not, when they're being asked, will say they're Jewish. So it's probably larger than that, but there's probably, we'll say 20, 25,000 officially who claim to be Jewish. Now, what is happening today, and then we got to it just at the end, is I think become very prominent over the last 2 or 3 years. And that, of course, is the issues with the Holocaust, as what's happening around Europe and other places. The extremists are becoming more and more anti-Jewish on the right and the left. It just happens in Poland that the right are the ones that have taken over. And so when this happens, one of the things you do is try and change history. And so what they're doing in Poland today is making it illegal to say Poles had anything to do with the Holocaust. They haven't got to the point now where they're saying there's no Holocaust, but they've gotten to the point where it's not allowed to be taught in their schools. So the government isn't officially saying there wasn't a Holocaust. The government's saying Poles were not involved. Not only that, if you say a Pole was involved, it is a criminal offense. It's a felony in Poland to say Poles were involved with the Nazis in the Holocaust. That is the big issue, because whenever you criminalize, a viewpoint or history, or when you prevent people from even, so if you can't say it, you can't teach it. What does that mean? That means even if you're allowed to teach the Holocaust, you're not going to teach the Holocaust. why would a teacher who is allowed to teach the Holocaust risk their reputation, their job, maybe even going to prison by even talking about the Holocaust? So you don't even have to have a law saying don't teach the Holocaust. By criminalizing certain viewpoints, you de-incentivize anyone from even attempting to teach it. And of course, this has created friction between Israel and Poland, which has had decent relations the last for a few years. But of course, as Poland has become a right-wing isolationist country as it had before, it does, when before it wants to be in the EU, now it's not doing all this. The Europe is kind of going the other way, where these countries are becoming much more isolationist, don't want to work with other countries, so become more connected to Russia. So right now, this is where we are, and I'll read the article that Larry sent, which was if you didn't get the article, it was really easy to read, and it was very interesting. Prime Minister of Poland gave a speech saying Poland respected the memory of those who died in the Holocaust. Polish president, due to sign the bill into law this week, but said he would send it to constitutional court for clarifications, allowing for possible amendments. There has been neo-Nazi groups becoming more and more prominent in Poland. And so that is an issue, which is also timed with this. People who are very right-wing are very nervous about appearing not to be an extremist for losing their position in the government. And so we see that in America, both on the left and right. You don't want to alienate the extremists because they're becoming more and more part of the mainstream. And so when that happens, we all lose, from my perspective. And again, I'm not talking about being right or left. I'm talking about when you allow the fringe on the right or left to move to the center, that's when issues, and as I mentioned, the far left and far right have more in common with each other than they do often to the rest of their parties. So I hate to be political, but I think, I don't think that's, new to anybody. So, and it's in this wonderful article so what's so disturbing is how quickly this has happened. This has all happened in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. I mean, it's just come out, and it hasn't come out of nowhere, but it's just the process has moved quickly. We've seen it in Muslim countries like Turkey. We're seeing it in places like Poland. Unfortunately, we are beginning to see it. And that is going to be very difficult if something like this happens in Germany, which has really been a haven for Jews, ironically, in the last 30 years. So we're seeing it in England. We're seeing it in a lot of countries around the world, and that's unfortunate. So we're seeing it in America. We're seeing the far left and the far right get more and more power. So this law is just, it's just, the reasoning behind the law is just so strange, because out of all the things you're doing in your country, you're saying, well, I'm going to add a law saying it's illegal to say that Poles worked with the Nazis. What does that have to do with anything? That has no effect on the economy. It has no effect on, it just doesn't. It's like seemingly out of nowhere that you have this law that really is not needed. Jeff, did you want to mention something?
We got the same thing going on here right now. There are laws being posed, like in Florida, that you cannot teach anything that will make any student feel uncomfortable. So if the student feels uncomfortable about the South once had slavery, you can't teach that anymore. That's the proposed law. And it really, basically you can't teach history anymore or anything else if these laws go through. But we're not above Poland or Germany or England or Hungary. We got our own laws pending right now.
That would have been great for me in high school, though. I would have gone up to Miss Tirina and said, Miss Tirina, math makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, here we go, right.
Larry and then Karen.
Yeah, I think that there's always been, a movement in history called revisionist history, where they do try to look at the other side of things. So it's always been there. I think what's really scary now is the rationale has become so muddled that here in Poland, not here, but in Poland, apparently the rationale for doing it is that you can't defame the national character. Anything that you do to make the national character look bad or say bad things about your country is subject to lawsuit. And the scary thing is that if you're an author, even in the United States, supposedly, and you write a book and that book is published in Poland, or specifically Poland's a member of the European Union, so that even if you wrote a book and it was in the European Union and it gets into Poland, you could be sued. It's almost like the case of that British woman, the woman from who wrote the book.
Lipstadt, Deborah Lipstadt.
Yeah, in Emory University. Yeah, I mean, in English courts and things like that. And Jane and I just attended, I think I sent out the information. There was a panel presenting information on this. And one of them was the former director of the new museum in Warsaw. And he was fired actually from his job.
I think he quit. Didn't he quit in protest?
He quit in protest. Yeah, but he was basically being forced out. And one of the reasons was the government tried to take over that museum and tried to take over many of the Jewish institutions there and cleanse them, so to speak. It turned out that museum had private funding and that it was able to withstand the onslaught. But in general, the scary thing about it is that people can be sued for saying things. There's always been this revisionist thing, and freedom of speech allows it. But now this question of the Supreme Court in Poland using this spurious argument, it seems like, of recognizing that if you say anything at all, bad about the government, they're saying, well, it was a Nazi thing. It wasn't a Polish thing. They only used our soil. They only used our territory, part of which is true, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is a lot of it is true.
Yeah.
You're not talking about the majority of the people who did it, but just to say no Polish citizen at all helped the Nazis. I mean, that's how can you say it's just impossible. So, and it's a difficult thing. Flossie. And you're still on mute, Flossie. There you go.
We're okay now? Okay. I sent you a list. I got an interesting email about some top Holocaust, and many of them are documentaries, films, with it being Remembrance Day now and tomorrow. Did you get it? Because I don't have a list of all the people on our class, and it's.
But you sent me a what? You sent me a list of.
I sent you a list of Holocaust.
Oh yeah, that was I did not get to it. It was you just sent it yesterday.
No, yeah. Well, I'm just saying.
Right, is that the one you sent yesterday? Yeah.
Interested because of it.
Oh yeah, that's great. I'm just looking at it now.
And what we're talking about, there's some very good films on it.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And they're all narrated by pretty famous actors as well. Yeah, do you want me to send that out to everybody?
I think they might find it worth it.
Okay, I'll send it out to everybody on the list.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, Poland today is, a good example of what's going on in the world. Unfortunately, we go back and forth, with rights of people. And so it's something we have to watch out. And again, for me, it's all about keeping the fringe on the fringe and not letting them get to the middle. So this will conclude here. The March of Living, obviously, if they're not going right now, it's because of COVID, not because of this. But if you have any of your grandchildren or children, or if you ever want to go on that trip, I hear it's really quite amazing. Difficult because usually they do that and then they go to Israel afterwards. Yeah. So you get a little bit different feeling. But I traveled through Poland and I had a great time. I did a little bit of the, going to the camps, but then my cousin was living in Europe and he wanted to see Poland and he did not want to do anything Jewish. Like he didn't want anything Holocaust related because he'd already done it. So I did that. And then we went all around. We went to Gdansk. We went to Capernaum. We went to Krakow, of course, which is one of my favorite cities. So it's really changed quite a bit pretty quickly, which is, Karen.
No, I was just thinking, I was going to say this before, and Larry mentioned it. With this new law in Poland, I would imagine, I was sitting here with this book, the Travel Guide to Jewish Europe, and I was noticing how many Jewish museums and sites there are, and how they're all going to have to go in and probably redo the explanations, whatever you call it, for every, and all the monuments and things. It's going to be a huge undertaking just to comply with that new law. Right?
Yeah, I would imagine you're right. When I went to Poland, it was in the 1990s. So they didn't have all this signage up yet with a lot of these things. You had to find it yourself or have a book to find it. But I hear now they've kind of put them up everywhere.
Germany,
and so,
Germany.
So it's much more aware.
Yeah. So,
but for next week, we had planned to study we had moved back next week because we did 2 weeks of this. We have Solani history. We're talking about the origins of the Maccabean games, the Apocrypha. We're adding now. We haven't talked about the Shanghai Jews, so that was one we just mentioned. So does anybody know what they would like to do next week?
You all sound good. I don't think the order is important, whichever one.
Yeah, there's no particular order here.
Yeah, so whichever you're comfortable with.
But anybody have any preference?
Well, you had mentioned that the part of Poland during the early 1900s, the sporting groups was established. And that really was part of the impetus actually for some of the Maccabean games, not only in Poland but a lot of the European communities. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, because that kind of leads into it as well. Because the Maccabean games were established almost at the same time in the 1930s, I believe it was the early 1930s.
And I know we could lead into sports, although he has left. Jonathan wants to do Jews and sports. So we could add that. We've done it before, but we could do it mostly on the Maccabean games and the origin and Jewish sports in general. How is that what people want to do?
Are we on? Can we bring in top Jewish athletes as part of it?
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. We'll do that.
Men and women.
Oh, yeah. Very good. And
I'm proud of you.
Yeah, I didn't realize I'm a big tennis fan, but the tennis player was the first person in Chile to win a gold medal, and he won 2 gold medals, I think, in 2000 or 2004. It was this guy Nicholas Massou, who's not that great. He was a good tennis player, but he just ended up winning the Olympic gold medal in singles and doubles, and I didn't realize he was Jewish. So.
Well, Mark Spitz, I think, when he was 14 or 15, he was in the Maccabean games, right. And he won several gold medals before he went into the Olympics a few years later.
Right. So I think a lot do
start sort of in the Maccabean games.
So we'll talk about the Maccabean games and talk a little bit about Jews and sports, which actually I am very knowledgeable, funny enough. So that sounds great. So I will send out the new thing, and with it, I'll send out the thing that Flossie sent me. Aaron, great to meet you in person.
Thank you. It was nice. This was very nice.
I think we have met in person already, though. I think we met. Did we meet at the bar mitzvah? Yeah. So I hope everybody has a good one, Jake. And so I'll put everybody on gallery view so everybody can say bye and hi to each other. We've had a couple people leave, but hello, everybody. And again, stay safe. And Karen, I will talk to you or give me a call whenever you have time so we can set that up.
No, you call me when you have time because I'm.
Okay, I can probably call you right now. So if you want to stay on, I'll take us off YouTube.
Sure.
All right, everybody stay safe.
Rabbi,
Yes, Flossie.
Did you get our email about Buc-ee's?
I did. I emailed you back.
Oh, okay. We didn't get it. So
yeah, that was.
See it, but we thought you'd be interested.
I was, yeah. I'm hopefully going to be going down there. I'm going to Orlando next week if everything, the COVID
it's
starts.
Coming up this Sunday. They're doing it.
If COVID continues to lessen, I have a conference in Orlando that I'm speaking at, so I need to go there. So.
But Sunday morning is doing it this Sunday.
All right.
After that, you won't be able to get in Buc-ee's anymore.
I know. But I seem to get there at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and every time they don't have any more barbecue turkey or barbecue chicken, so I have to get there earlier.
That's
Stay
another
safe,
problem.
everybody.
Take care.
You
Bye.
too.